Hello everyone, this is a continuation of my lecture series for Population Geography for Module 7, Immigration. What we're talking about is international flows, humans crossing international borders. Between developed countries is one way this happens. So from, let's say, Europe to North America, this is typically, in today's age, mostly professional, people who have high-skilled jobs. Whereas in the past, the migration flows between, let's say, Europe and North America were quite extensive. Today, they're not as much. Between developing and developed countries is where much of the action is happening. This is tightly controlled because developed countries want to really regulate how many people they allow in. It's subject to all kinds of controversy and cultural and political debates. Some countries use a merit system. Some countries do it through humanitarian purposes, a combination of both. We'll be looking at all of that. And then lastly is between developing countries. This is mostly laborers. Let's say people from Pakistan working in Saudi Arabia in the oil industry would be an example. As you can see by this map, the net migration flows are coming out of Asia into North America and Europe, to a secondary extent Latin America into North America, some going into Australia and New Zealand. And then there are lots of other minor flows that happen across the world as well. If we look at this infographic, take a look at North America. You have an orange circle and a green circle. The green circle represents the number of people coming in. The orange circle represents the number of people going out. So you can see most people are coming to North America, as opposed to Latin America and the Caribbean, where the orange circle is much bigger in comparison. And if you take a look at Europe, there's a lot of internal migration within Europe these days, say from France to Poland, vice versa. And so they're fairly equally paired here, although there are people coming from the Middle East and other places into Europe. That's why the green is a little bit bigger. Africa is a bit of a out-migration, not as much as Latin America, but still people are leaving. Asia, of course, because it has the largest number of people in the world, you also have the largest circle, but also you can see that there's a general flow that's out-migration. And in Oceania, its general flow is in migration. At this point in 2015, 48% of these migrants were women. The average age is 39, and about 15% were children. There's a lot of theories why people move across national borders. I'm an immigrant myself. I actually was born in Italy and migrated here when I was 8 years old. So this is a very common story. Let's consider some of these theories. First, let me outline them here. There's this classic supply and demand theory. There's the new economics of migration theory based on family choices and wages. There's the social network theory, the dual labor market theory, the world system theory, cumulative causation theory, and institutional theories. And then we'll take a look at the effects of national policies on migration. Let's start with the dual labor market theory. This idea is that basically labor is an essential part of economic activity. They're basically divided in this theory into two sectors. The other thing that's happening that's really important is that a lot of countries in the developed world are responding to their aging population by promoting immigration from other places. If you look in particular, Europe has been growing older for decades now. You can see these maps, how the number of elderly people is growing compared to the young people. It's particularly the case in Southern Europe and Western Europe, where you see that the number of young people is actually shrinking quite dramatically as compared to the number of elderly. So this is a problem. This is not good for an economy, especially a capitalist economy, where you need a lot of growth and you need a lot of labor market forces to do that. There's this pressure for these countries to open up their borders to allow immigrants in. There's a counter pressure, however, which comes from the cultural side. A lot of people resist open border policies or generally more generous migration policies because of cultural reasons. And so there's this give and take that happens all the time across developed countries. Generally what we've seen in history is that corporations, the establishment and elite, want to allow more migration and they're open to migration flows, whereas occasionally you get these backlash movements that happen where you have particularly right-wing populist movements that arise that try to tamp down and stop this flow, or at least severely reduce it, as we've seen in much of Europe and our own country in the last 10 years or so. The other one is social network theory, which is about looking at individual decisions that link migration flows. One example of that is a chain migration pattern. So you have an initial migration that creates a hub of small number of people, and through their personal networks, through their family networks, they sponsor more people to come in. And eventually, what happens is it creates larger and larger communities in the host country. In the end, what we can call this is a kind of social capital, or capital is, in a sense, something that produces wealth. And so, in a way, a lot of researchers have discovered that by bringing in a lot of people like this, it does eventually lead to better economic conditions as more and more people are coming in, bringing in their talents and their bodies, basically, to be able to participate in the economy. And also they become consumers as well. World systems theory is about globalization. Essentially, the world's becoming more and more interdependent. There's this dependency is between all of the world, but in particular between developed countries and developing world. The developed world is able to go post-industrial because it could still get its industrial base from other places. North America was able to minimize the number of industrial jobs because China and Mexico and other places were filling the gap and providing for those products and services. And so that creates interdependence, that now all of a sudden we find ourselves in a situation where we're very, very dependent on these products coming in from developing countries. And they're dependent on us for creating higher level services and for providing stability in many other ways. The term that's used oftentimes for this is means of production. When we went from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy, we saw changes in the way things were produced. Those changes were related to globalization. That is, we went from national economies that were more independent and could function on their own mostly, to global economy where every single country now is a part of a larger global network. And no country in and of itself can do everything for itself. It has to rely on other countries. Another theory is a cumulative causation theory, which is looking at how immigration shapes immigration itself. When immigrants come in, they begin to interact with society and they begin to change some of the social dynamics in that society, which creates a desire for more immigrants to come in. What happens is there are pull and push forces working here. Countries that are providing immigrants, poor countries, developing countries, have largely low national productivity. Oftentimes they can be in economic decline, so the average person doesn't have much money. They can't even afford school, and hence they don't have much education. There's not many opportunities. The workforce is undertrained, so it leads to continued low productivity and continued economic decline. And this cycle of poverty then, if again gets so bad that people have no option but to leave and become international migrants. People, for the most part, do not want to leave their country unless they feel like they just don't have any opportunities or it's dangerous or they must leave. There's some exceptions to that, of course, especially with young people who like to travel and like to move. But for the most part, most people are fairly conservative that way. There has to be really, really good reason for somebody to leave their home and go to a different country. This is oftentimes necessitated because of the conditions that are there. And then as countries become rich, there's another cycle we can look at too that looks at wealth in developed countries. There are regions that have started to develop early. They have more jobs and larger populations in the beginning, like Europe did. This creates more and more demand for goods and services. There's an expansion of existing industries and for formation of new businesses. It creates a lot more wealth. That profit gets put back in, more infrastructure and more services create even easier means to create more economic activity. Better transportation systems, better communication system all lead to higher productivity for the entire country. And so that in turn creates even more development, more increases in populations and jobs, more increases in demand and so forth. And this multiplier effect eventually leads to developed countries. However, this does not factor in things like global exploitation from colonies and so forth, which led to a massive amount of wealth that was taken from parts of the world into Europe, in particular, and then North America. This is a model that doesn't incorporate a lot of other issues that people will find problematic. Institutional theory is basically that you get the formation of all kinds of institutions that related to migration that in turn facilitate or help people move across the world. They provide services and support to people to be able to do just that. A great example would be refugee agencies that help people resettle in other countries. This also can be illegal. Like, for example, there are institutions that smuggle undocumented migrants across borders as well. It is largely legitimate institutions that we're talking about here. So you can start to see that migration is very complex. It's not a simple thing about just people moving. It has all kinds of rich dynamics associated with it, as this chart is showing. The host region has a lot of pulls or pull factors. The regions where people are coming from have a lot of push factors. But migrants come into from developing countries into developed countries, and then they send their money back to their home communities in the old country to help their families. This is called remittances. Remittances can sometimes be so important to a poor country that if you were to cut them off, it would collapse the economy of those countries. There's also external issues like climate change. There's sustainability issues. There's institutional issues. There's conflicts. There's security, on and on and on. It's a really complex matter to look at, this phenomena of people moving across the world. When you see it play out in the media or in politics, it's usually radically reduced to the simplest form. So people will make arguments based on what they want and basically cherry pick the data and the information and their research to match their own particular opinion. This is very, very common, and they don't really want to see or care to see this complexity because it doesn't conform to their belief. If you look at the surveys around immigration, what you find is views of immigrants in Europe and the United States. Look at the individual country and you see big differences. Some countries like Germany and the UK, and to some extent the United States as well, have generally positive views of immigrants. Other countries like Greece, Italy, and Poland have generally negative views of immigrants and whether or not they serve their host nation. In the United States, we have a big divide between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans are far more likely to say immigrants have a negative impact on U.S. society, and the Democrats are far more likely to say they have a positive impact. As you can see by this chart, if you look at specific issues, Republicans are very concerned about crime, for example, that immigrants are making crime worse. They're concerned about the economy, that it's making the economy worse. And honestly, if we look at the data, it really does not hold up to those fears. But it's really hard to convince people of that when they're embedded in their own belief systems that are reinforced by social media. But overall, though, with younger people in particular, what's been happening over the last decades is that there's been an increasing optimism about immigration in the United States. Until about the Trump era, and then things started to change. Up to about 2015 or so, there was a growing encouragement about immigrants and a growing popularity of immigration. More and more people began to feel that they were a positive versus a negative. That's all been thrown up in the air with the latest politics, but essentially that's where we were going. If you look at young people in particular, the younger a population, the more positive they tend to be about immigrants. So you can see here that millennials are far, far more positive about them than earlier generations. Immigrants are not more likely to use social services than native-born people, despite the concerns about that. If you look at different kinds of social programs and compare native-born with immigrants and Hispanic immigrants, you see there's very little difference. And some of the differences are so small they're negligible in terms of statistics. The costs and benefits of immigrants in the United States labor market is essentially positive overall, but on the local scale, there are cases where it can be negative for workers. So that's also true. So overall, for the entire economy, the data is very, very clear that immigrants increase economic activity and benefit an economy. But on a local level, sort of industry specific level, sometimes it does tend to hurt native workers. So it's a complex picture. Now, these remittances I was talking about earlier, this is what it looks like. For example, in the United States, people come in, they settle here, they send their money back to countries like Mexico, the Philippines, China, and so on. And it's a significant amount of money. Countries in deep red here indicate that more than 10% of the total economic activity of those countries are based on this money coming in from the United States back to them, or from, let's say, other countries. Here you can see in this area where I'm circling, this is Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and these countries are now the main cause of the migration flow coming in that's causing so much controversy in our country. These countries are basically in shambles. They have a lot of problems, and so people are fleeing and they're going across the United States. If we were to restrict this flow, think about what would happen. Less people will be moving in, less money will go back into these countries through remittances, and these countries will get even worse and eventually potentially collapse. And then the migrant flow will radically increase. And so we'd be in a situation now that we've had stronger laws to try to stop them, but far more people coming in, and will create a humanitarian nightmare, which is already kind of starting to happen. The solution isn't necessarily a military one, to just arm the border and stop people from coming in. It has to be an economic one. Here's an infographic that shows the amount of money we're talking about. It's in the billions of dollars in many places. The top recipients for migrant remittances are the larger countries that have the huge populations in the world, obviously. That makes sense. China and India. Countries that are receiving these remittances, they tend to be extremely poor countries, countries that have a lot of issues, including what I talked about earlier in Central America. The other thing that we see internally is that a lot of migration is happening primarily, in particular, California, New York, and Florida are getting the most. Those three states make up almost half of the total inflow coming in. I want to focus on Latinos. A lot of us have friends or know people who are Latinos. It's a huge part of the American experience now, American population. This is controversial in terms of how many people we should let in, what we should do about undocumented workers. What we're seeing here historically, in terms of demographics, is that Hispanics or Latinos, and this has been the flow and the growth. This gap between this light line and this dark line, 37 million, is due to immigration. This will be the natural growth if there were no immigration, but with immigration, this is a far, far greater number. The growth was much, much bigger. It certainly is not the case with African Americans, where the difference is very, very small, because we're not getting nearly as many immigrants. With Asia, it is the case. It's just the numbers aren't quite as big, but most of the growth is coming from immigration. And with Caucasians or whites, what we're seeing is that it's not as big and it's flattening out. The growth is actually starting to flatten out by 2015. If you were to look the last 10 years, what you'd see is it's starting to decline. We are getting some migration from, like, let's say, Eastern Europe, Russia, but it's not that much of a difference in terms of growth. If you project this into the future, if our immigration policy stayed roughly the same, we would see the Hispanic population grow to over 100 million in the next decades. If we were to cut off immigration, it would still continue to grow, but less so. Asia in particular, though, is pretty dramatic in that sense, where is the vast majority of what we're going to see for growth is going to be in immigration. If we were to stop this immigration, there would be no growth whatsoever. With African Americans, you see that there's a slighter growth. It's not as steep. Without immigration, it would be a small difference of about 10 million over the next several decades. And with white populations, you'd actually see a significant decline without immigration. These numbers, by the way, are too conservative. The latest data showed that this is even more extreme in terms of decline. If you were to do this today, you would see lower numbers. The growth would begin to slow. So these projections are a little bit off. Immigration policy is certainly front and center today. There are a lot of things that have been happening in this regard, but there's a long history that I want to trace before we get to what's happening today. First of all, what shapes the law? And it's primarily a labor force crisis of developed countries as populations are aging, which I already mentioned. More pro-immigrant policies are enacted. But there is political and cultural resistance, what we can call these largely as nativist movements that happen that want to restrict immigration. In our country, we've had several such movements across our history, including the one today. Ultimately, it comes down to really being shaped by issues of identity and belonging. That is, that immigration is really a part of a much bigger and broader debate about who we are as a nation, about our culture. Where do we want to see our country go? How do we feel about ourselves? Really, there's a lot of controversy, a lot of differences of opinions along those lines. How do we imagine ourselves? Who are we? There are certainly icons and traditions that we can look back at. The American Revolution, the Statue of Liberty, all of that has been about immigrants coming and taking part in our society. But also, we have to understand that this country was founded by Northern Europeans, Anglo-Saxons primarily at first, and then others, and Christians. And those two identities formed the basis of our history. At the same time, our country's always been subject to multiculturalism, from indigenous people that were here first, from enslaved people, from like the fact that a big chunk of our country used to be part of Mexico when we took it over. And there's a lot of Latino history here, and then migration coming from the rest of the world subsequent to that. So there are political and human rights debates associated with these issues. They manifest as things like social services, who gets to have a driver's license, who gets the right to work, who gets benefits. It's a big mixed mishmash of problems and questions. A lot of the controversy and political fighting around this goes back to understanding who we are and our own sense of identity, and how that is really being contested by different groups in our society. The other thing to consider is that the state, the government, is not a totalitarian government. We have limits in our control of what we can do. There is a lot of undocumented immigration in this country. There always has been. It hasn't been nearly the problem it is today in the past. Before, it was certainly just pretty much a part of America, and we didn't really talk too much about it. There's a black market or informal economy, certainly around things like drugs and guns and so on, that flow back and forth between borders. There's a massive amount of wealth in the form of guns and drugs and cash that flows back and forth that really shapes this country as well as other countries in profound ways. There are all the push and pull forces, and no matter what our government wants to do, they're going to be there. Economic forces, cultural forces, environmental forces that are just going to do their thing, no matter what we want. What government can do perhaps is manage some of these things, but not control them fully. And then the big one, of course, is the economy. The economy is, the formal economy is massive and huge and central to our existence, and it has its own demands and pressures that will shape how the human flow happens. We've had many attempts at immigration laws. Starting way back in the beginning of our nation, you had the Naturalization Act, which basically was very generous. If you were a white male, you only had to live in the country for 2 years and you became a citizen. For others, not so much. It has changed over time. But again, we started out as very much embedded in white male privilege. You can argue this, till cows come home, but it's just the evidence of history that this is who we are, this is who we were. And we slowly change and become more inclusive and more universal over time, but this is our heritage, as is the case in many other countries in the world. The Naturalization Act was amended, and we turned it to 5 years, which has stayed that way since. There was a sort of a first wave of sort of nativism that happened after that, and it was lengthened to 14 and then went back to 5 years. The Naturalization Act of 1870 followed the emancipation movement of African Americans and allowed aliens of African nativity, quote unquote, and persons of African descent to become U.S. citizens for the first time. There were more acts to follow, a lot of them more exclusionary, including racially exclusionary. For example, the Chinese were barred from entering, specifically. Blatant a racist act, and that's just the way it was. The same thing happened for other groups like the Japanese later on. The Immigration Act of 1891 created the Bureau of Immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act was strengthened again in 1892. Essentially, until the 1920s, our immigration policy favored strongly Northern and Western Europeans. In the 1920s, in the early 20s, there was another nativist movement which tried to curb immigration at that time. And immigration plummeted in the United States. It dropped dramatically. So by the early 1930s, of course, by then we were embedded in a global depression. We were heading into World War II. Immigration went down to a trickle. Back after World War II, this is a major changes began to happen in the way we saw ourselves as a nation. Not exclusively so much Northern European, white, Christian, but we began to open the door to allow other folks in, other people of different religions, different ethnicities, different parts of the world. Eventually, by the late 60s, we began to follow a policy that was family preferenced. So if you had family over here already, they could sponsor others to come. And that was the primary way that people came into the country, rather than skills, rather than jobs-based policies. A few other things have happened since. There was a major Reform Act in 1986 under Reagan. And of course, you had the Homeland Security Department after 9/11, which radically changed things as well. The Immigration Reform and Control Act was an effort to try to stop the flow of undocumented immigrants coming across the borders. And what it focused on is punishing employers who hired illegal immigrants. It also gave amnesty, a pardon to those who had been entered here illegally in 1982. There were other laws across states that have restricted immigrations. The states themselves have tried to impose different laws. Some of them have been found unconstitutional, some of them are accepted. The most recent one this year, where Texas has passed a law that allowed Texas to actually put people in prison for crossing the border, which is usually something that's only done exclusively by the federal government. This went to court, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has passed it and let it go, and it has allowed it. And since then, 9 other states have started or are starting similar laws where state governments are now beginning to take charge of immigration policy, which is a brand new thing in America in many ways in terms of like that level of enforcement. The states with the strictest immigration laws tend to be places in the Deep South and in the Southwest. I would certainly add Texas to this list now. And because of those laws, the illegal immigrant population declined dramatically, especially in Arizona. But it didn't decline for the whole country. It shifted populations to other states. Now we have the U.S. Border Patrol. Their job is to prevent smuggling and unlawful entry across the borders. They have all kinds of surveillance and operations and interventions in order to do that. More and more they're using new technologies like drones to help them. Despite that, the number of apprehensions at the border has been up and down, but generally declining over the last 10 years. And a lot of activity has begun to shift in doing enforcement away from the border in remote areas. This has brought up a lot of illegal issues, and especially because the nature of the kind of people who are coming over the border has transitioned to being more children and families than it was before. And also because, of course, we are dealing with a new world after 9/11 of terrorism, national security, and there's always the old issue of drugs and the drug wars from the 80s and so on that they're dealing with. The Trump administration initially began to focus on trying to deport people in this country. One of the groups that they focused on were children who were brought over at a very young age and became adults in the United States. And really, their whole identity, their whole sense of being, their language and everything was American. A lot of people began to see this as a human rights issue because a lot of these kids were being deported or risked being deported to out of this country, even though they themselves really consider themselves fully American in their identity, in their outlook, in their life. They have been raised here. Me, myself, I was 8 years old when I came to the United States, and I really have very little identity with the country that I was born in. I identify myself as fully American because this is how I grew up, and I can totally understand that point of view. And so as the laws began to be passed and as the controversy grew, a lot of particularly progressive areas of the country began to create sanctuary cities to try to protect these young people that by now were in their late teens and early to mid-20s, in order to try to stop the federal government from deporting them. Now, Trump's proposal was to give some unauthorized immigrants immigration status, just like in the 80s, but really primarily spend most of the energy in creating a border wall, also to try to stop people from sponsoring close relatives to come over, and shifting to a more merit-based system. A lot of this never actually ended up happening. Even the border wall was halted. And so immigration policy has really continued to be very controversial. We have not had a comprehensive change in many, many decades in terms of the whole policy itself as one system. We've changed bits and pieces of it, but we have not looked at the whole thing and redesigned it based on 21st century need. We are unable to come to an agreement on it. In terms of the census, it does affect a number of congressional districts. So the census matters. The big controversy, of course, is on the right, Republicans believe that it's to their detriment to allow a generous citizenship policy for the census to count people, because then it will give more congressional districts to Democrats. And so they fought really hard. One of the reasons why there is a lot of focus by the Republicans on immigration is because they feel that immigrants are generally more liberal and would vote along with Democrats. Them trying to stop or limit or reduce immigration is essentially a political necessity for them. That's how they see it. It's not so clear. The picture is mixed. A lot of Latinos, for example, are fairly conservative. Some of them are very religious, so they don't always vote with Democrats. There's been efforts to try to get immigrants to come to the Republican side, which have been relatively successful in places like Florida and Texas. So this kind of narrative is more of an ideological one, which has some merit, but it also doesn't always make a lot of sense. Let's take a look at the border. Here is the Rio Grande. That is part of the border along Texas. The face of immigration has changed, as I said. A lot more children are coming in, and a lot more children are coming in without families as well. So this has been a real nightmare to deal with for all the administrations that have been dealing with this, from Biden to Trump to even Obama. All have had to deal with this change. And of course, as they tried to deal with it, it became extremely controversial, especially during the Trump era, where you started to see images of these children behind cages and under very bad conditions. Some of them were separated from their families in such a way that they lost connection to their parents and never were able to find them again. So it created thousands upon thousands of orphans that have never been reunited with their families because of bureaucratic snafus. So it's been a real problem, and it's still a challenge today. And of course, this is always being used for political purposes to create controversy and try to damage the reputation of the other side. So it's really complicated and difficult to understand what's actually been happening because of that. But it is a humanitarian crisis, to be sure. In 2019, one study showed that 95% were families or unaccompanied minors, and also that there were not enough facilities to deal with the influx of these people coming in. As opposed to going back a few decades earlier, with most people were adults who came first and then later might bring their families. This is a very different phenomenon that's happening now. The other thing that people might find surprising, there's a lot of narratives, there's a lot of hype, but what does the actual evidence show? What does the data say about this crisis? And it turns out that if you look at the numbers, over the last few decades, the border crossings have been declining. And then they sort of leveled off recently and have been going up in this last year, which we'll talk about in a minute. If it is such a major crisis now and compared to the past, the numbers don't show it. The numbers seem to suggest that it's less of a problem now than it was in previous eras. But people don't work with these numbers, they work with narratives and stories, and this is why so many people are so riled up. The undocumented populations in the US were rising dramatically until about the early 2000s, and then something happened that created a stop to that rise. And what it was the 2008 financial crisis. It really reduced the number of jobs in the United States, while at the same time, the number of jobs in Mexico were getting better and better and better because of globalization. Essentially, the push and pull forces changed. And that's what led to this change, especially in Mexico. If you look at in the 90s, the growth was tremendous in Mexico. And then by you get to 2008 or so, and all of a sudden it starts to decline dramatically. Because in Mexico in particular, there's been a huge increase in manufacturing jobs because of NAFTA. The pressure for people to move greatly declined, and then once the financial crisis hit and there weren't as many jobs in the United States, the trend reversed itself. That's not what happened with other countries, though. There are other parts of Latin America in particular that never saw the benefits of globalization and never saw increasing economic activity like Mexico did. So what's been happening more recently is that in the last 2 to 3 years, especially after the pandemic kind of waned, we started to see much more people trying to come through the border. So as this general decline and then leveling off we saw in the past, now it's beginning to rise pretty dramatically. And so this is causing a lot more people to focus on this issue today. Again, the big difference that we see here is that if you look back in the past, there were less families and less children coming, whereas this trend, even in the last few years, has really been notable, where a large percentage of people traveling across the borders are children and families rather than single adults. The opinion in this country is really split by ideology. Americans think there's an influx of immigrants because America has a lot of jobs. And that's basically both true for Democrats and Republicans, roughly about the same. A little bit of a difference, but not much. But Democrats tend to understand that there are also push forces, not just pull forces, that are at work here, and that a lot of people are coming to the United States because they're fleeing violence in their own countries. So almost 80% of Democrats feel that way, believe that, whereas only about half of Republicans do. So starting to see a big difference here. Democrats tend to be a lot more generous about U.S. immigration policy. They're about split 50-50 whether or not they like it, whereas Republicans are very negative towards immigration policy in the United States. If we look at the border, it's viewed as a crisis primarily by Republicans and not as much by Democrats. So in total, yes, most Americans see it as a problem, either a major or minor problem. But if you look at Republicans, the strong majority of Republicans see it as a major problem, especially conservatives, where it's 81% here, as opposed to Democrats, where they see it as a problem, but it's not necessarily major. Most people in the Democratic liberal side see it as a minor problem. What do we do about the border wall? Should we expand it, or should we make safe and where should we put our money? Expanding the border wall or creating safe and sanitary conditions for migrants? Humanitarian or security? So what you see is a big difference between Democrats and Republicans, obviously. Republicans believe we should have much stronger security, and Democrats believe we should provide a lot more resources and safe and sanitary conditions for migrants. So it's a very, very different outlook. Here's the border here along the U.S.-Mexico. The border wall went up in little bits and pieces. There was already some wall there to begin with, so wasn't a new thing. It was there before. It was been expanded and beefed up. Hasn't done much good. It hasn't really worked that well. So the wall itself, here's what the wall under Trump looked like. Much bigger, much sturdier, much taller. And here's some prototypes before they chose on the final one. You can see the seriousness of this wall that they wanted to do. One of the reasons for it, too, it wasn't just to stop illegal immigration. It was to stop drugs. You can see North America is 40% of the users of this drug trafficking trade, which is tremendously huge considering we're only 4% of the world population. So it's a really big problem here. Largely Central America is where a lot of the drugs are coming from right now. So something to consider is how would this wall limit drug trafficking? And it's unclear because much of the traffic material comes from ships, comes from underground tunnels, comes from other sources, not just people sort of muling them across the border. Undocumented immigrants live primarily along the border, but they're found everywhere. And as these states become more strict in terms of their policies, it's very easy for the undocumented just to travel to other parts of the country, which they have done. Even in places where you wouldn't think there were many, like Iowa and Minnesota and places like that, you see significant populations now of undocumented immigrants. One of the responses, especially under Trump, was to cut aid to Central America. And that had negative effect on the crisis here, because the more in crisis these countries become, the worse the conditions get, the more powerful the push forces are to force people out. And then they become refugees, they become migrants, and they come to the United States, irrespective of the fact that it's more difficult, more dangerous to get in. These, in particular, Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Honduras, South Guatemala, and you can include South Africa here, or as a reference, have very, very high murder rates, far higher than even in the United States, which is known to have the highest murder rate among developed countries. You can see how much higher it is. And if you think the problem is bad here, it's 10 times worse in El Salvador. So this is the kind of thing that's forcing people, that's pushing people out of the country. If you begin to limit immigration and less remittances go back to these countries, as you see what's been happening here, if you cut back on aid, then these countries lose major sources of income and become worse. Worse places. The push forces get even worse. I can't stress this enough. I'm repeating this over and over because this particular phenomena, this dynamic, is not even talked about, especially by the right, which don't want to hear it. All they want to think about is security, security, and security, which has limits. One of the most secure places in the world, by far, is the border between Israel and Gaza. It was an impenetrable barrier until recently. You saw what the consequences are of just primarily focusing on security when dealing with these kinds of issues rather than humanitarian needs. It just creates a boiling pot, and eventually that pot just overflows. We see that here as well in the United States to a lesser degree. What we need to do if we really want to stem the flow of undocumented people from coming to the United States is we need to help tamp down some of these push forces that are forcing people to take really dangerous journey and risk their lives to try to establish a better life for themselves. I worked with refugees from these countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and I can tell you, none of them wanted to leave their country. They did not want to leave. They left because they felt they had no choice. So just putting walls and barriers and restrictions at the border is not going to necessarily deter them. It's just going to make it harder and more dangerous for them, which means that eventually it just creates other kinds of problems will boil over. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I look forward to seeing your work. Take care.